I want to tell you a story that's been hidden away for years. The facts are all true and go something like this. A forgotten tornado impacted 5 religious sites where miraculously everyone was spared. It threw a car and its occupants into a water tower, almost got 2 meteorologists fired, and sealed the fate of a 10-year-old boy who would go on to make tornado prediction a reality. Oh, and its damage was so widespread it galvanized the entire nation into demanding better weather broadcasts. Take a look at what happened in 1957, and then I'll tell you the story of the Ruskin Heights EF5 and the mind-boggling and miraculous events that took place that day. In order to understand just how monumental this massive tornado was, you'll need to know a little more about the worldview of the Americans it impacted the most. The 1950s are usually remembered as an era of icons like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Elvis, and Lucille Ball, but it was also an era full of color and dramatically shifting social standards. By 1957, there were 60 million registered vehicles in America, and almost everyone had a family car. Drive-in restaurants, drive-through fast food, and drive-in movie theaters were all the rage. In the wake of World War II, Americans had experienced a prosperous economic boom, but it was overshadowed by the Cold War. Both the United States and the USSR were competing for scientific supremacy and the ability to control rockets, satellites, and space exploration in general. Dr. Martin Luther King was working tirelessly to advocate for civil rights, and the U.S. had become politically involved in the Vietnam conflict, though we did not yet have soldiers abroad. Americans wanted to prevent the spread of communism, and fears of a nuclear holocaust ran rampant. Tensions were high, and the uncertainty of it all meant that even school children were practicing duck and cover drills in case of air raids.
And you, duck and cover.
That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
The ability for Americans to travel further from the city meant the concept of suburbia was almost inevitable, and tract housing began emerging all across the United States. This led to the development of suburban areas like Martin City, Hickman Hills, and Ruskin Heights, all just outside of Kansas City, Missouri. Since the need for inexpensive housing was so great at that time, construction quality was based on inexpensive materials, keeping labor costs low, and minimalistic and simplified floor plans. This, of course, meant that very few interior rooms and closets were incorporated, and basements were rare. There simply weren't many places to hide, even if you were aware of an oncoming threat. Radar was a relatively new technology, and its innovation was primarily driven by the military needs of World War II. Much of it was sold through military surplus. Its implementation and weather forecasting was still in the experimental stages, and very few people were trained to use it anyway. In 1957, the U.S. had installed warning sirens in some areas for fear of air raids during the war, but they were not in use everywhere and hadn't necessarily been implemented to alert the public in case of a weather emergency. Storm forecasting relied on a network of meteorologists that could disseminate information to the public, and that job was incredibly difficult, and on May 20th, 1957, that system's strengths and weaknesses would be tested in incredible ways. The tornado touched down at approximately 6:15 p.m., right around the time everyone was sitting down for dinner. The path of the tornado actually straddled the states of both Kansas and Missouri. These photos were shot in the tornado's earliest stages from a local airport facing north. This difference shows how quickly the supercell grew in size. It began its journey 2 miles southwest of Williamsburg, Kansas. As the tornado grew in strength, it traveled at about 42 miles an hour and approached the sacred historic Antioch Cemetery just northeast of Homewood. As it struck and damaged several graves, it flung the headstones incredibly far from their owners' final resting places. After passing Ottawa, it intensified, and residents later told harrowing stories about seeing greenish-gray clouds turning violently. Locals reported seeing 5 to 10 tentacles reaching down out of the cloud and bouncing off the ground, then joining together. Today, we know that they were probably observing the multi-vortex stage of tornadogenesis, which can often be seen in modern tornado footage, like these images from Tushka, Oklahoma, and Dallas, Texas. Once enough debris is picked up, these individual vortices are no longer visible, and the tornado assumes the monolithic form of the wedge tornado. The Methodist Church had survived disasters before the tornado. It had served as a place of both worship and local community programs. Originally built in 1890, it had been battered by a tornado just a decade earlier and had nearly burned to the ground only a year earlier in an intense fire. This monster was photographed by Reverend Robert Alexander as he was looking north at the tornado. He captured it just before the church was struck. 40 or more celebrants were attending a birthday party and were spared by seeking shelter with the Reverend. Virtually every home and building in Martin City was damaged or destroyed that day. This disaster would be the final blow to the old church, but the damage in Ruskin Heights, the tornado's namesake, would actually be far worse. Many of the God-fearing people in this region were children when the disaster unfolded. As adults, their recollections affirm just how bizarre and bewildering these events can be through the eyes of children. And later in this video, you'll see how incredible it was that anyone survived.
On May 20th, 1957. My mother, father, and myself survived the tornado. I was 14 years old and lived just a few houses down from the high school. We had moved into our new house with no basement. I was doing my homework. I got up and looked outside. Our neighbors were all out in their yards looking at the sky. My dad threw us in an oversized chair, and I remember all of us praying at once for the Lord to protect us. Then the house was gone. We saw something moving in our yard. It was our neighbor from 5 houses up. It had picked him up and dropped him in our yard. A friend of mine found my new cap and gown, still in the box, on the Bocena Baptist churchyard about 5 to 7 miles from our house. Our refrigerator was twisted as if you had wrung it out like a washcloth, and when we pried it open, nothing was broken, not even the eggs. I had my hair up in pin curls and the bobby pins were all straightened out, but not driven into my head. I could go on and on about the strange things that happened that night and the days to follow.
The landscape was a post-apocalyptic nightmare in Martin City, and the National Guard was brought in to enforce martial law. A local bank was critically damaged, as well as a furniture store and a car dealership where it was reported that several Chevrolets were found blocks away from the dealership. But what about the Methodist Church? Miraculously, no one there died. It was demolished only a week later and was rebuilt entirely. It actually served the community as a church until the 1970s, and it still echoes the design of its predecessor, and it's still being used for ceremonial events as the Martin Event Center. The residents of the area celebrate there because it symbolizes longevity. In 1945, a local family with a different path of faith decided to build a small place of worship, but the construction of Faith Tabernacle quickly ran into problems. At that time, World War II was being fought overseas, and the military needs of the nation trumped any other in regards to the use of construction materials. Somehow, word eventually reached the White House, and Bess Truman herself convinced her husband, then President Harry Truman, to make an exception for this project. In 1946, construction began, and the first services were held even before the roof was completely installed, literally in the open sunshine, surrounded only by walls and pews. None of them could have known that only 1 decade later, the house of God would come crumbling down in a matter of seconds. Again, miraculously, no one was hurt. Like many of the other local churches, Faith Tabernacle was rebuilt very quickly and reopened in 1958. It has undergone many transformations over the decades, and it still stands today. Although it has changed hands many times, it still continues to hold religious services and provide for the betterment of the community. Martin City, Hickman Mills, and Ruskin Heights were home to folks of all sorts of denominations, including a large congregation of Catholics. St. Catherine's Parish was both a church and a school for local children. Ozanam's Home for Boys, originally a Catholic-sponsored orphanage, had become a school for disadvantaged boys with mental and physical health issues. After the tornado, things changed drastically at St. Catherine's Parish. Even though the building wasn't directly struck by the tornado, Ozanam School for Boys was. Miraculously, 23 boys housed there were spared by seeking refuge in the basement during the tornado, and again, no one there died. Both of these institutions were pillars in the community both before and after the disaster. The children that attended school at St. Catherine's Parish observed the drastic changes and the darkest moments just after the disaster.
I attended St. Catherine's from 1948 and graduated in 1957. The athletic banquet the evening of May 20th was our last day at school because of the tornado. I saw it coming after we rolled up the windows on Dad's car and we warned everybody. We were glad it missed us, but many were less fortunate.
May 20th, 1957. I was at the church dinner. We headed to the corner of the church basement to hide, and Father Reiser led us in the rosary. No more school that year. I lost a fellow Cub Scout baseball player who lived in Ruskin Heights.
The Catholic school closed after the disaster and began administering help to the public, and the charity work conducted through the recovery period really paid off. St. Catherine's Parish closed its doors permanently in April of 2023 after 98 years of service. The building still stands as of the recording of this video, though its future purpose remains undecided. Ozanam School for Boys stands stronger than ever, now a large campus. It is still a treatment center for youth, and it is a pillar of outreach and impact in the Kansas City community. It's important to remember that some areas were hit far worse than others. It's the devastation in the vicinity of the Ruskin Heights subdivision that was so catastrophic, it ensured this tornado would be forever referred to as the Ruskin Heights EF5. In the aftermath of this tornado, it was discovered that on its 71-mile trek across Kansas-Missouri state line, the tornado tragically killed 44 people and left 531 injured. The damage was approximately $2.5 million at that time, or about $30 million today. And its impact at that time rivals that of any modern EF4 or EF5. Ruskin Heights was the first tract housing development in the Kansas City area. Most of them did not have basements. In retrospect, the fact that these homes didn't have tornado shelters was absolutely normal for the time, and it still is in many parts of the U.S. today. It is unknown if photos of the Ruskin Heights Presbyterian Church exist, but it was dedicated on May 19th of 1956 and, unbelievably, just 1 year later was destroyed by the tornado. Survivors on various blogs today still recall the churchyard being used as a makeshift morgue in the hours following the tornado. When interviewed decades later, Jim Crowley, who was only 9 when the tornado struck, summarized the psychological impacts of the tornadoes on children.
It was so loud, I couldn't hear any glass breaking or anything. It sounded like 5 or 6 freight trains crashing. I searched for my best friend, my dog. I found him about 3 backyards down from us. The storm had taken him. That's when the horror of the storm hit me. I realized that the storm could have taken all of us.
According to those who were closest to him, the boy didn't speak for 5 days after the disaster. Though little of the church remained, 6 days after the tornado, the surviving parishioners rallied together where only the foundation remained. Over 300 people were in attendance at that last service, and the Elks Lodge gave out clothes to residents so they could dress up one last time. They stood where brick and mortar had once stood, and now only the ghost remained. Miraculously again, no one died at that location when the building was struck. Historically, legends have always arisen after a major catastrophic event, and the Ruskin Heights tornado was no different. As the decades have passed, many stories have been lost forever. However, one grim tale seems to linger on. Today, most people know you cannot outrun a tornado, but at that time there were no sirens or warning systems, so for many it seemed like a good idea to get out of the tornado's path. The story of little Bobby Davis is still memorialized and revisited on the anniversary of this tragedy. Just shy of her 4th birthday, the tornado hit her family's 1955 Chevy as they were attempting to flee. The car was picked up and carried and at some point flung into the town's water tower. It was recorded that she had to be rescued from the mangled maintenance walkways of the tower itself. Her mother, Catherine, age 25, died instantly, and so did her sister, Cornelia, age 7. However, Bobby and her father survived after long hospitalizations. This story might seem utterly unbelievable were it not for the fact that the same thing happened as recently as 2011 during the Smithville tornado. After the storm had passed, it was obvious that something large and powerful had put a massive dent in the town's water tower. Later, it was confirmed that a Ford Explorer had been picked up about a quarter of a mile from the location of the tower, and that after it struck the tower, it traveled another quarter mile and landed. The warped and twisted metal was barely distinguishable, and accounts say that paint samples were used to verify the incident. There was a fatality associated with the owner of that vehicle, but out of respect, I chose not to investigate that further. If you are interested in learning about the Smithville tornado of 2011, I highly recommend watching the Smithville EF5 tornado second by second by YouTube creator Tornado Forensics. I will post a link in the description, but in my humble opinion, they are doing incredible historical work, and it was an unfathomably violent tornado. Their breakdown is the best of its kind on YouTube. At its strongest point, the tornado was a staggering half of a mile wide. Most tornadoes are small and, on average, on the ground for less than 15 minutes. The Ruskin Heights EF5 was on the ground for an hour and 38 minutes and was part of a massive, prolific tornado outbreak that year. Truly an unstoppable behemoth that refused to dissipate until it finally lifted near Knobtown, Missouri. The media descended on the area minutes after the disaster unfolded and began delivering the images of destruction to televisions across America. As I previously mentioned, weather broadcasting at that time was very much in a transitional period. It had always been assumed that the word tornado shouldn't be used simply out of fear that it might spark mass hysteria or misinform the audience. It was for this reason that meteorologists Bob Babb and Joe Audsley were genuinely caught in a moral dilemma. They had verification from storm spotters and valid information regarding the destruction that had already taken place. With that information, they felt confident in their analysis and issued a tornado warning for Ruskin Heights and the surrounding areas. The story goes that at that time, they genuinely thought they would be fired the next day. Ultimately, they issued use of a public tornado warning and are credited with saving hundreds of lives. Without their courage and warnings, many more people would have died that day, and the public knew it. Because of the coverage of the tornado outbreak being so widespread, the public became aware of just how important their local weathermen truly were, and it set a precedent for how meteorologists would interact with their communities ever after. 10-year-old Leslie Lemon was a resident of Grandview, a large area situated near both Martin City and Hickman Mills.
My family got in the car and drove away from our house in Grandview, away from the approaching tornado. We stopped approximately 1 mile south and watched the tornado pass to the northeast. I saw lots of debris in the debris cloud around the base of the funnel. As I recall, some of the larger pieces could be seen aloft and some distance away from the funnel. I knew almost immediately that I wanted to study weather.
Leslie would go on to become a research associate meteorologist and developer of Doppler radar. In establishing what scientists refer to as the Lemon technique, he gave forecasters the ability to predict the indications of tornado genesis. Effectively, had Les Lemon not witnessed the Ruskin Heights tornado at the age of 10, tornado prediction might have taken far longer to achieve within the scientific community, and God knows how many lives were saved in the decades following his work. The mental health toll on the survivors is still evident to this day. many of the town's current residents recall that passing train engineers would blow the train whistles far more often than they had before, just to alert residents of their presence so as not to be mistaken for the sounds of another tornado. All deaths from natural disasters are simply horrible, as each life means so much to the community. That being said, part of what made this tornado miraculous was the nature of how few died, given the circumstances. The long-term impacts of this particular tornado cannot be overstated. If you ever visit the Ruskin Heights area, take a minute and stop by the memorial that was built a year after the tornado to honor its victims. Also, I'd like to note that photographer Gray Valet for Time magazine shot pictures that are amongst some of the most enduring images I've ever seen of tornadic devastation. I highly recommend you view his photos online if you get the chance. If you love tornado history, join our new community. Go to historicastorms.com and explore some of the cool things to do and latest news. Or click the link below to join the Tornado Tribe at Patreon. You can get access to early content and our members-only Discord where you can help build up this channel. If this isn't for you, please just like or share or comment. It helps tremendously and allows me to make other tornado content. Y'all be safe, be kind, and remember, you don't have to ride out the storm alone.